So let's talk a little bit about Ben, because he's young, he's eager, he's caught up in all those machinations of big business. Tell us a bit more about him and how he came about and how you wanted his journey to develop across the book.
I knew the theme I wanted his journey to explore. I didn't know where it was going to end up. So the question for Ben was going to be someone ambitious, someone who wants to make a mark in the world, who starts out thinking that means replicating the kind of success that the previous generation, my generation, appeared to have defined as success. And then discovering that he didn't want it and then having to work something else out. And I didn't honestly know exactly what that something else was going to be. So what does he do? He's forced to confront by the events in the book and by the woman, Connie, who comes into his life, or in truth comes back into his life, although he didn't first time round realise that she was in his life. He's forced to work out what it is he wants and to say, actually, I want to define a kind of success for myself where I don't end up saying, I wish I hadn't gone to business school, or I'm against markets, or I'm just against capitalism. But you can see by the end, I mean, partly he's now in a relationship, he's a father, and certainly I absolutely see as a career coach, and I'm delighted that more and more men actually are taking fatherhood as something that they want to integrate in a planned way into their career. But he ends up doing something using his business skills, but where he's his own boss, and where he realizes that the kind of work he chooses to do, the kind of way he chooses to behave, whether that's to customers, to employees, to his business partners, or to society at large, is something ethical, and those ethical questions are not ones that he shuffles off onto the heads of either philosophers or captains of industry. They become questions that he wants to take responsibility for the ethical decisions in his own business life.
Definitely. I think it's interesting that you talk about ethics, because the Ben at the start of the novel is completely different to the Ben we meet at the end of the novel. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the other characters that kind of influence him, because it feels to me that he goes on a bit of a not necessarily a coming of age, or a kind of coming of heart, where he starts to really think about the world around him and what part he wants to play in that.
So Connie, for example, in a way you could say she goes on a bit of a coming of head journey. I do teach classes from time to time at Chaos Business School here in London. One of the things I most enjoy teaching about is power and politics. And Connie's journey, she's full of heart. And she left the private sector because her business was destroyed by some underhand behaviour. And she doesn't realise initially, but she comes to realise that that was by Ben. Anyway, that experience of making a whole company of people redundant in a setting where there wasn't a lot of other work for them scars her, and she decides to take her skills, which are in personnel, into the public sector, and she moves into the NHS. And when we catch her at the beginning of the novel, she's all heart and she doesn't really want anything to do with power. In her experience, people who have power are near the top of organisations, and they're not particularly pleasant people. So right at the beginning, she's just been accepted to become a governor of this business school. She's not particularly keen to do it. She doesn't really. It's not something she's lusting for to build up her CV. But the journey she goes on, as she takes that responsibility seriously, she comes to have to make some decisions. She discovers something about what the head of the business school is up to, which is borderline behaviour, borderline ethical behaviour. And she has to decide whether she's going to use that to force the head of the business school out right away, or whether the ethical questions she's grappling with are a bit more complicated than that. She ends up thinking they are a bit more complicated than that. She does end up making the head of the business school leave, but in a way that's a bit of a compromise. And so she's actually coming to terms with the fact that she has power, and that exercising power is tricky. But the truth is, and this was what Machiavelli was trying to say, I think, if the good people in the world, whoever we think they are, decide that power's dirty and they're not willing to use it, we end up with a world in which all the power is used by people who aren't the good people in the world.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I think there's a lot of characters in the book that are questioning their idea of ethics, and they have slightly different ideas of where on the kind of ethical spectrum things should take place. Was it fun for you to play around with characters who have different ideas about how ethics and business should come together?
Absolutely. And I mean, this book would not have come to be, it's a first novel, this book would not have come to be without some outstanding kind of teaching, mentoring and editing contributions, well, from Guy Meredith, from Craig Taylor and from Martha Ellen Zenfel. A common refrain for all of them was, God, Douglas, you know, this is a first novel. You've got so many characters, so many points of view. Is this really wise? I remember Craig, after his major read-through of it, said, actually, I see what you're trying to do, so try and work with it, but it means you've got to kind of simplify. So, yes, so one of the ways you simplify is by having pairs of characters that either do the same thing or kind of diametrically opposite things. So there are two, on the ethical spectrum, there are two religiously zealous truth seekers in the novel. Greg, the chauffeur, and Frank, the academic. And we see what happens to them. And one of the things I wanted to do also was on gender. I really wanted this, it's for you to say whether I succeeded rather than for me to say, but I really wanted this book to have stories that had a rich range of female characters, that they weren't all good or bad or weak or powerful. So that was another dimension where certainly that's what I was trying.
I think you definitely achieved it. And talking about that 0.01%, two of the characters that I found sort of funniest in the book are the sort of from that 0.01%. They're the super wealthy. You have Ben's first boss, Alex, and you have Casey, who has inherited a large amount of money, and they are both on the more ridiculous spectrum of life because of the what they can afford to do. Was it interesting to you to play out with those perceptions of how people react to the super wealthy, how the super wealthy can behave, what they can kind of get away with, which the regular person wouldn't be able to get away with?
Actually, those two characters, Alex, who fires Ben right in the opening chapter, I hope a riddle that is motivating to follow for the reader through the book is that Ben realises he's a bit puzzled why he's been fired. Because he honestly believes, and the more he tries to check it out, he was actually a star performer. And the answer to the riddle is something I believe to be true in real life. And indeed, Ben is a star performer, and yet from Alex's point of view, from that 0.01% point of view, there is quite a logical reason to fire Ben. So that's one of the things we follow in the book. And I think that's a question that I've had from MBA students and others that I coach. If I really want to get to the very top, is trying to be the best that I can be and working really hard and delivering all the best results, is that enough? I think the answer is it's not quite enough. What's the missing bit? Well, one of the missing bits is luck, but one of the other missing bits. So I hope Alex gives a piece of honesty there that we may or may not like to be true about the world. Okay, so the young billionaire. Well, it was just fun to imagine a character. I mean, capitalism, the idea that actually everything is better off if it's owned by the market, if it's got a price that's going up and down by the minute. And I just thought, well, why not imagine someone in his 20s who floats 49% of himself on the stock market and play with that idea? So he does, and I put enough of bits of straw together as to how that could work. And he goes around with these digital cufflinks that tell him second by second how much he's worth. And that was about kind of saying, fascinating, isn't it? Capitalism keeps saying, this is good for you, that's good for you. It's good medicine for everyone to, we should have marketized hospitals and marketized this and that. And it's a kind of a sitting duck, really, for saying, okay, so if it's so good, let's see what happens if we apply it to the real plutocrats.